All right, hi everyone. Thanks for being here today. So my project that I'm telling you about today, it's a subcomponent of my dissertation work, and it's going to be a little bit different than some of the other talks you maybe heard today. And it's specifically talking about how we're going about developing a model that fits into a decision-making framework that we're working to establish in the Southeast. I'm going to tell you about that larger project in which this component fits into, and then why we think an adaptive management framework is so important in this context, how we're developing our model, how we're using simulation to vet our model before we apply it to real data, and then forthcoming steps. So I'm working with state wildlife management agencies in Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, and Alabama. And the alligator harvest management programs across this region vary in scale, the number of harvests that's allowed, the distribution of harvest zones, the size of harvest zones. So in spite of operating in very different kind of decision contexts with different regulatory constraints and opportunities, all of the states have an interest in sustaining the harvest for the public and maintaining the population within some limits. And none of them feel like they have a very good understanding of kind of the underlying biological mechanisms that drive population change through time. I think I turned the projector off. Okay. So the main focus of our work is helping them establish a better decision-making process for setting annual harvest regulations. And so we're using structured decision-making as kind of our organizing framework. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this approach today, but it's a value-focused approach. So before focusing on what can we do, we focus on what are we really trying to achieve. And the process disentangles all of the kind of constituent parts of the decision problem. So each can be focused on and dealt with independently before they're integrated together to inform your decision-making. And this disentangling and focusing on parts related to policy and parts related to the science helps managers better understand whether disagreements are over the projected outcomes of different alternative management actions or how those different outcomes are valued by stakeholders. And harvest decisions are kind of begging for an adaptive management approach for two key reasons. They're recurrent, so we revisit them on a regular basis. And the decisions we make today are going to affect our decisions that we have opportunities to make in the future. Furthermore, they're uncertain. We don't really know the consequences of our alternative actions. And so adaptive management from a decision theoretic school of thought in which we kind of would classify ourselves focuses on, among the many uncertainties, one key uncertainty being that we don't know how the population will respond to management interventions. And so in order to address this uncertainty, we need some kind of predictive models that we can use within the context of a dynamic optimization process that will help us understand what the consequences of potential actions are, how optimal they are in light of what our objectives are. And the dynamic optimization process doesn't only think about our decision now, but it thinks about the decision now and how that affects all of the forthcoming decisions and how all of those are influenced by the learning that will accrue through this process, this adaptive process. So some of the challenges that managers currently face in terms of understanding how the population is going to respond to harvest is we don't have a really great way of linking our data to our decisions, and there aren't really robust models for doing that in the context of a lot of harvest management programs. So currently, a lot of data sets are collected and then isolated or analyzed in isolation. And so we have count data, and then we might account for some kind of detection probability. And that's going to tell us something about abundance. But then we take some nesting data, number of nests, productivity, eggs, and that's going to help us understand productivity. And then we might have some kind of mark recapture, mark recovery study where we're looking at survival rates. But really, all of these things are driving population change over time, and current ways of analyzing these types of data confound variation or our understanding of variation in the data that arises from true variation in the underlying ecological system that we're focusing on and variation arising from our imperfect sampling of that system. And the consequence of this is these are some graphs that I can't even read up here this close, but from Florida, where they actually looked at, based on the estimates we're getting from our data, what parameter value, what aspects of the population are really driving population change over time. And so things such as proportion of females nesting, survival of juveniles and subadults. But they found that these estimates are really uncertain, and small changes in the values of those estimates can mean very significant changes. And so this is basically like population growth, and these are small changes in those different parameters. So getting a different estimate of that parameter can mean very different things in terms of what you then think is happening to the population. And so they're inappropriate or unreliable in terms of informing management decisions. And so what a lot of states do currently for making their management decisions is they look at trends in count data. So they take counts, sometimes they average those counts, they put a just statistical line fitted to those counts, and then they might have some kind of decision thresholds around those average counts to say we can increase harvest in this area or decrease harvest. And when I say that, I primarily am referring to increasing or decreasing like the quota or the number of permits that are allocated that year. So we're advocating for using a relatively novel population modeling framework. It hasn't been applied in it hasn't been used in a lot of applied settings, and to our knowledge has not been used to inform game management decisions in particular. And integrated population models are really wonderful in that they actually allow you to capitalize on the little bits of information, all these different data sets that inform kind of our understanding of underlying processes such as survival and reproduction. So you can combine different data sets into a common model, and then you can separate out the parts of uncertainty arising from different aspects of that data. So whether the observation process, the population process underlying it, and ultimately get better parameter estimates, and even fill in missing data gaps in some cases. These models are built in a state space framework. So what this means is that we separate out these two underlying processes. So you have some true population that we can never see perfectly. What we see is some portion of that population, there's some probability of detecting individuals in that population, then we get this count data. And over time, this population is changing, and so is our count data. But by modeling these two parts of the process separately, but in a connected way, we can better understand what we're managing and what we're observing. So integrated population models, this is kind of a schematic. So we have this is that population that was represented with some cartoon alligators a moment ago. Some true population we don't really see. There's some number of individuals in that population. We imperfectly detect them and have some count data. But we know that population size is influenced by productivity and survival. And so when we can incorporate all of our productivity data, so number of nests, number of eggs, that tells us something about the productivity parameter, that rate that is influencing changes in population size over time. Similarly, you incorporate mark recapture, mark recovery data, again influenced from some imperfect capture probability and recapture probability, and then harvest data, that's the thing we're actually manipulating with our management decisions. And then you have multiple pieces of information informing those really key important demographic parameters. So we're capitalizing on the fact that we have these wonderful state participants and they're giving us their data. And so we're going to be able to use the data from across this range to build a model that helps us understand population dynamics across the range as well as potential variability within the range. So potentially by habitat type or in relation to some other physiographic characteristic. And we're going to start with the best case scenario before just getting everyone's data and trying to put it into a model. We're going to focus on data that was collected through the 1980s and early 1990s as part of an experimental harvest program in Florida. So this was before alligators were delisted from the Endangered Species Act. Florida started this experimental harvest study. And so for a set of lakes, they have all of these different data types over the same period of time, which is really incredible. So we can start by fitting our model to these data to see if our model works. But before we do that, we're going to start by fitting it to some simulated data. So we're going to take some estimates of the population parameters that those past analyses provided, and then we're going to make our own population. So Hatchlings have some probability of dying or becoming juveniles. Juveniles have some probability of dying or becoming yearling. Hatchlings become yearlings. Yearlings become juveniles of one of the sexes. Juveniles have a probability of mortality, a probability of growing into the subadult class, a probability of surviving, remaining in their size class. This is repeated for adults. Adult males can potentially become bulls. The females have some probability of producing nests. I'm sorry, this is low for you guys. The nests have a probability of surviving and producing more hatchlings. So we created this true population. So I have thousands of individuals that lived over the time of my simulation. I know how old they were at every single year. And so this is a sample of 8. So individual number 1 was a hatchling in year 1, yearling in year 2, and was harvested as a subadult female in year 7. So for these individuals, we then say, okay, this is the truth, but what would our count data look like if we were to sample this imperfectly? And from that, we see that not everyone gets observed. So in the first year, we only observe 1 hatchling, 1 subadult, and 1 bull. That would be like the count data we'd be working with in real life. We repeat this process for mark recapture data. So we say these are the individuals. All right, each year, everyone, depending on how big they are, has some probability of being captured. They have some probability after being captured of being recaptured. And when they're recaptured and captured, we know how old they are. We know that they've survived if we recapture them, or we know that they were killed in harvest if they turn up in our harvest record as a tagged individual. Similarly, productivity data for the adult females in the population. Some are nesting. We observe those nests. If they had a nest, how many eggs were in that nest? So then we take all of this imperfect data that represents the kind of data we would have in real life, and we try to fit the model to this data. And we try to see if that model can give us estimates of those underlying population demographic rates that we care about: productivity, survival, movement into the next age class. And then once we get those estimates from the model, that was fitted to our imperfect data, we can see if those estimates match the demographic rates that we actually told it when we made our population. So we know the truth. We know what those underlying rates are because we made the population from which this data came from. And then we repeat that tens of thousands of times. And we realize over all of those iterations, we have some kind of proportion of times that the model actually predicted or estimated the correct demographic rates. And that gives us some confidence that this model will work with our real data when we don't know the truth. So once we get the simulated data fitted to the models and the models perform well, we can start fitting it to this best case scenario from the experimental harvest 1 lake, then some of the other lakes, and then eventually expanding into the larger range. These models then will have alternative versions of them that represent different hypotheses about the kind of way the population structures. So is there density dependence? Is harvest an additive source of mortality or a compensatory source of mortality? So is it a source of mortality that adds to death in the population, or does it just make up for some other ways animals would have died naturally? And over time, we use these models to help us identify optimal policy options. And at the beginning, we may not know which model is best, so all models seem equally credible. And that's going to influence kind of what our optimal policy recommendations are. But once the decision's made and actions carried out, harvest occurs, and monitoring data is collected the next year, we can take that data and compare it to what the different models projected. And then by looking at those discrepancies between the model's projections and what we actually observed, some models will start to appear to be more credible than others. Some are actually representing that true underlying process better than others. And they'll become more credible, and they'll start driving that optimization process more. So their kind of influence and projections will help us identify optimal policies more often than the other models. This has been done with waterfowl management, and over time, these different models have diverged. You can see some models, this one has harvest as an additive source of mortality, I think with density dependence. I'll have to look back at the acronyms, but so you learn over time. So your policies and your model credibility evolves as you learn. So we're using this new modeling framework that can capitalize on all the data that these states already have and make better use of it, and then use it to inform this adaptive harvest management framework so that the states can actually make better decisions directly related to their data through a transferable process or a transparent process and hopefully save time and money and alligators in the future. These are our collaborators I'd like to thank. Warnell and USGS are our primary funders, the 4 state agencies that we're working with, and then the Southeast Ecological Science Center for USGS and the Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Units in these states. Thank you. I'm sorry I don't have any time for questions, but